Welcome to another broadcast of mindyourhealthcast.com. I want to get into a subject this time that has been one that I've looked at for a long time and considered for a long time, and decided that I had enough information that was pertinent that I was ready to bring it up for discussion. The topic that I have chosen has an interesting title. I'm calling it the Body Parts Supermarket, or it could be subtitled the Pick-a-Part Shop. It's interesting because I guess some of this was prompted by a book that I ran across a long time back as I was considering the whole subject of organ transplants, called The Body Bazaar. I've shown it to you before, and I'm showing it to you again. Repetition makes permanent. This is subtitled The Market for Human Tissue and the Biotechnology Age. Now that's on our website, on our book list, and we'll be adding some more if they haven't been added already. I think they may have already. That will give you some more information. I consider it to be extremely important because at first thought, the idea of receiving not arguing that someone shouldn't do it if they feel compelled to do it, and if someone feels compelled to donate an organ. But if that were all there were to it, it wouldn't be so bad. But as we really look at it in depth, you will find that it's not all that simple. But there are a lot of issues involved, and I guess the one that bothers me the most is that everything that on the surface seems to be good, as you look into it, there of course is a dark side. And the dark side is that there's always the merchandisers who step in and figure out how to make something very profitable, and even to the point of resorting to rather shady behaviors, and in some cases, as some of the material I'm going to bring up borders on the edge of murder. I will be presenting some material as we go through this. I'm not sure we're going to get it done in one session. We will try. I will move along, but there's a lot of things to consider, and so it may be that it might take 2 sessions to get it all in. I have a stack of things in front of me. You don't see them probably at this point that I'll be referring to, but there's a lot out there, especially when you assemble it all together and look at what all has been written. And there's one, actually it's like an essay, it's really as large as a book, that was written by an investigator who interviewed doctors and nurses and hospitals and organ procurement organizations and donor organizations, and out of all of that, you're going to find this pretty interesting. This one I'm thinking I might post on my website that you can download the book. It's of considerable size, not terribly big, but of considerable size, but I would encourage everyone to read it because I'm not even going to be able to touch the surface of the in-depth material that was covered. It appears that after having lived on this earth for quite some time, I have noted a lot of changes, as I have mentioned before, but especially in the field of health and medicine. I've seen health go down and medicine go up. That in itself is a problem. And I've raised that issue before. If everyone thinks that modern medicine is everything that it advertises itself to be, why is it that we have a tremendous bill, $1 trillion for a year, and we have sicker and more seriously ill people than ever? Now, I know that the diet and nutrition is part of it, and I know contamination of the environment is part of it. But from what I can see, the nature of the medical treatment today is a major contributor also. In fact, maybe the biggest contributor, because if medicine understood the body properly, they would be able to offset a lot of the other issues. But inasmuch as they themselves are a major contributing factor and profit from it, then I don't suspect that's likely to happen until the public becomes educated and demands something different. And they get away from, as we mentioned last time, by Dr. Mendelssohn and another writer from France about the religion of medicine. That we revere them to the point that the doctors become priests, etc., etc. So, the problem with this issue right now that we're looking at, which is the subject of this broadcast today, has to do with organ transplant. Now, it, of course, involves other tissues of the body besides the organs. The skin, bone, and nervous tissue, and all kinds of things that are involved in the process. But, of course, the biggie is the organ transplants. That's where the big money comes from in the whole system that has developed. Now, right away, the question in my mind is, having been around a long time, as I mentioned, why is it that we have so many organ failures today? As I was growing up, I don't ever recall any when I was young. I never heard of somebody having, other than a heart attack, which in itself was rare, and cancer, which was extremely rare. I think I only knew of 1 or 2 cases in my early life of cancer, and I only knew of, within all the realm of people I knew, 1 person with a major heart attack. And that was considered a real rarity. Now, the heart cardiovascular issues are supposedly number 1 in the U.S. as far as causes of death, and cancer is right behind that. And so something certainly has changed. So to me, what has gone on that has caused all of this organ failure? So as I begin to look and consider, and I have given this a tremendous amount of thought, as you probably know, I've worked in the natural health field for 35 plus years, pushing 40, and I have worked to keep people from having transplants, in fact, even to keep them out of hospitals, and have done that relatively successful, and I've also had to work with many people that went through all of this. The problem being, the one that I can't do anything with, is the person with the organ transplant. Because once they've chosen that approach, they basically have taken on a one-way street, so to speak. There's no turning back. Once you've made that commitment and your organ is removed and another is put in, you are committed and you are stuck with it until you and your life separate at some point. That's unfortunate in the sense that it's not, again, as simple as it's thought. Now, I think that the American public, based on the information that they get, thinks that it's a very simple procedure. You just go in, they take out your organ, put the transplant organ in, send you home, and you live happily ever after. Again, that would be one of those rose-colored glasses ideas. However, that's not quite the way it is. What it really means is that you've now taken on a whole new set of issues that few people consider. And so we want you to know about all of that, and we want you to reconsider what I consider to be, of course, the best of all, which is to preserve your organs and keep them healthy and keep them in. And you don't have to go through that. And so it bothered me as I started looking, why, over the years, do we have more and more organ failures? It just, to me, is almost an epidemic. The waiting lists out there are terrible. And if you look at some of the numbers, it's quite unsettling. I just had printed out from one of the donor recovery networks some information just recently called Organ Donation and Transplant Statistics. And one of these statistics that I ran into was the waiting list. Now, this was as of September 2011. I don't have any current ones, and they evidently haven't been much compiled yet that's been published for 2012. But as September 2011, in the United States, there's a grand total of 112,248 people waiting for kidneys, livers, and kidney-pancreas combinations, heart, lung, pancreas by itself, intestine, and heart-lung combinations. The biggest, of course, on the list is kidney. Now, the question hits me right off about all the kidney problems and the kidney failures. First of all, we have two kidneys, so if there's a failure, that means we've got two organs in the body. Even though they perform similar functions, there's a slight difference between the two kidneys as to what one does more of than the other. But the bottom line is we have two kidneys. They're very critical to stay alive because they have to do a lot of things related to the blood and body to keep things working properly. Control blood pressure, they control the production of red blood cells, and they control the elimination of toxins, or at least a lot of them, out of the body. They help balance the blood-water levels. They help balance the removal of a lot of toxins out of the blood as an end product of liver detoxification and all types of things that they have to do. So they are critical, but according to this list in the United States, as of September 2011, there was 89,984, about 90,000 people on waiting lists in this country just for kidneys alone. Now that represents the lion's share of the big total of 112,000. So some interesting information came to me recently that maybe explains some of that. I was doing a lecture in another state for a group, and at the beginning of the lecture, as I was setting up to get started, there was a lady came in and sat down and opened up a laptop computer, and she saw me up front getting ready to do my presentation, and she said, "I want you to know that I will be paying attention to what you're saying, but I'm doing some research and I can search it on the computer while I'm listening to what you're saying because I'm working on a PhD." So then she went on to elaborate. She said, I finished a pre-med program. I was accepted into a medical school, and I was considerably along in the medical program when all of a sudden, as I started hearing and seeing things as medicine is taught and practiced, she said, I began to become disenamored. And she said, the more I learned, the more I realized that I could not be a participant in the modern health system as it is taught and practiced today. And then she went on to say that in that particular city, which was a sizable city in that state, there is a doctor who has been advertising to other doctors about a business plan that is going to make them a fortune. And he said, here's the issue. He said, we know that right now we are prescribing several drugs to patients that are slowly destroying their kidneys. And that in another 2 to 3 years, there's going to be a rash of kidney failures. And therefore, there's going to be a huge business develop in dialysis. And he said, we are going to open several centers, and each of those centers should make us about $10,000 a day because of all the dialysis. Now, as I thought about that, I thought, it's interesting to me. Here is a physician who supposedly took the Hippocratic Oath, although I'm not sure they're taking that anymore. But it says, above all, do your patient no harm. That's one of the major portions of it. Now, here's a doctor who is writing prescriptions for drugs that he's giving to his patients that he knows is destroying their kidneys. Now, what is he doing? Is he looking for other alternatives? Is he looking for a way to avoid giving those drugs? I don't know what all of them are, but as you look in the PDR, you will find that there's a list of the organ systems in the body that are affected by each of those drugs. Now, sometimes you'll see that one of them is highly emphasized, like you must monitor kidney function because that means this drug has a considerable adverse effect on kidneys. Or it may say you need to monitor the liver because, as we've said before about the statin drugs, that they have a tendency to destroy liver cells. And so the conscientious doctor that's going to use the statins is supposed to periodically run a blood test on liver enzymes to see if the liver is holding up under that drug. So here we have the doctor who has supposedly, as I say, in business, in a profession actually. I know that's been made into a business, but it was to be a profession of helping people, and is knowingly making his future business to make a huge amount of money by prescribing something that he knows is going to damage and destroy his patient's kidneys, and then he's going to be postured to make a fortune off of it. Now, the average, I found out, the average dialysis patient costs between $30,000 and $40,000 a year for dialysis. So that means that if you had several thousand patients, you can imagine what kind of money you're talking about coming in. And he was figuring that they were going to make $10,000 per day for each of those centers. So you tell me, in my mind, what he's doing is a direct contradiction to everything that I would think that a physician would do, and that's why this young lady said, I cannot practice medicine the way it's practiced today, so I quit. I got out of medical school. I have changed my whole direction in education, and she's now completing a PhD in health, and she plans to help people around the world that are the so-called victims, I guess I would call them victims, of modern medicine and modern life, and really help them get healthy. So here, to me, is the big problem, is that now we have other drugs, like I mentioned, the statins that can damage your liver, and the heart is susceptible, like people with cancer. The chemotherapeutics are damaging to the heart, to the kidneys, and to the liver, and some of them to the brain. And so the treatments that are being administered today by modern medicine are actually causing organs to fail. And on top of it, then we have all these carcinogens and chemicals that are present in the environment, which we never had before. When I was real young, we didn't have all that. We didn't have all those pesticides and herbicides, and we didn't have all of the chemical additives that are put in food today. We didn't have all the food dyes that are made and colorings that are made from coal tar products or petroleum products. None of that stuff existed. Pretty much the major contaminants in our environment, especially in the U.S., and I'm assuming around the world, have come from modern chemistry. And I always remember DuPont advertising better things for better living through chemistry. I'm not so sure that we're getting the better living because of the increase in illness. And the fact is that cancer and the cardiovascular problems, the two major ones out there, both are susceptible to all of this that's going on in terms of our food and environment. So we have a big problem that has come up, and then, as I say, when we look to medicine, which is supposed to be the art, the healing art that's going to protect us from all of that, is actually more concerned with figuring out how they can profit from it. Now, I'm not saying every doctor is like that, but I'm saying there's a lot of them out there, and I'm saying that pharmacology and the business of medicine is the major portion of it. There are some doctors that I've known personally who have gone into medicine, and in the process, they realized that what they were doing was not helping people. So what did they do? They started looking for alternatives. And the alternatives that they looked for and adapted were those which were from the natural health field. Things that vitamins, minerals, nutrients, detoxing the body, all those things that could help to make one healthier, as opposed to pouring more drugs in and creating more symptoms and then giving more drugs to manage those symptoms, and then more drugs to manage the symptoms of the drugs that were given to manage the symptoms. So it goes on ad infinitum that more and more is being done to rapidly get the patient out the door and to manage their symptoms, so at least temporarily they'll feel better. But as I've said before, we pay a tremendous bill to get some temporary comfort by managing our symptoms at the expense of our health. When you consider that the major portion of the symptoms that we experience are generated by the body's immune system to get rid of something that should not be there. And every time we take a substance that turns off the immune system so that we don't feel the redness, heat, swelling, and pain, we've talked about that many times, the four symptoms of immune response or inflammation, and an inflammation is an immune response. Don't let anybody kid you. Inflammation is not a disease. I've seen some books that kind of lead you to think that inflammation is a disease, and what do you do for it? You take an anti-inflammatory. And what does an anti-inflammatory do? It stops those symptoms. And how does it stop those symptoms? It stops them by turning off immune function. So we pretty rapidly, if we think about it, we can understand why we've now gotten into this situation that people's organs are failing. If you keep putting all these toxic substances into the body so that they will cover over your symptoms, there comes a time when one or more organs in the body can no longer manage it. I've watched over the years the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. Now, without even getting into the whole idea of what's behind it, the bottom line is that the joints have been infiltrated by poisons. The body inflames to try to get the poisons out. And so what do? We want to try to turn off that inflammation. So a long time ago, there wasn't too much to use. Then along came the steroid products, cortisone, prednisone, etc., and anti-inflammatory painkillers like Motrin and that whole family of ibuprofen and so forth. And we brought those out to turn off the inflammation so we would be more comfortable. But then over time, that wasn't always strong enough, so we turned to the steroids, which were a little more powerful at suppressing immune function. And sometimes when that wasn't enough, we took it a step farther and we gone to a drug called methotrexate, which is a strong chemotherapeutic agent but a powerful immunosuppressor. Now, what are the adverse effects of methotrexate? It damages the heart, it damages the liver, and it damages the kidneys. Now, then, anybody that's put on that, if they survive it, it's a matter of time till one or more of those organs are going to let go. And then you're in big trouble. Now, it used to be the only way any organ would be damaged if you somehow had some kind of accident or you were exposed to some extremely toxic substance, which was rare earlier years. Now there's more of them out there. And so now here we have the treatment is destroying the body. I personally know of an individual that was in his 30s and he had psoriatic rheumatoid arthritis, and he didn't like the breakouts on his skin, and so he consulted a doctor who tried the other things, especially the steroids, and when that didn't seem to control it, they decided to put him on methotrexate. And within a period between 1 and 2 years, his heart was destroyed and he died. in his 30s. So, as we mentioned before, that would be considered an iatrogenic death, meaning the death was caused by the treatment. Now, I hope you remember those names we mentioned before. The nosocomial illnesses are those that come from being in a hospital, and the iatrogenic are those that are caused by the treatment. And so between the two of those, I know that's why Dr. Mendelsohn said, again, in his book, The Confessions of a Medical Heretic, the worst thing we can do for our health is go to a hospital. And it's true, and he didn't say it in jest. He said that as a practicing physician and knew that that was the case. So now we have a problem. We have all these organs that are being stressed and strained by all of the things that people are taking to suppress their symptoms, and at the same time we are putting more and more garbage into our body, and we haven't gotten into that as heavily as we could, but we will be pretty soon getting into a lot about the food industry and some of the things that are being done that are very, very destructive to your health and, of course, to your organs. So we need to develop, and if you want to stop this organ problem, you have to look for other methods. Now, what we're going to talk about a little bit is the whole concept or idea of organ transplants. First of all, the demand, as I mentioned, here's 112,000 waiting in the U.S. as of September 2011, and more are going on the list every day. So now we have a big problem. We have all these organs that need to be transplanted because they're failing. Now, the question, or the next big problem that has arisen out of that is that, guess what? There's not enough organs. So far we have to rely on organs that are donated or organs that are, we wouldn't say, cut out or removed from people at death or near death, and or are donated by somebody. But when they're taking organs from a person, they don't say they're removing them or excising them or whatever. They've chosen a euphemism. They're harvesting the organs, and that sounds better to say to someone, we want to cut out your loved one's liver or their kidneys or their pancreas or their heart at death. They say we're getting prepared to harvest them, and therefore it doesn't sound so bad. So that's a big problem. So here we have all of these organs that need to be replaced, and we don't have enough organs. So that in itself creates a couple of things. One is, which if you've been paying attention, is illegally removing organs from people, like kidneys. Kidneys are at the top of the list. The kidneys cannot take all the junk that people are doing and all the drugs they're taking, so the kidneys are failing. So the biggest demand is, of course, for kidneys. And a lot of people will donate their kidney. They'll put, while they're alive even, for a friend or a relative or whatever, and so they'll give up one of their kidneys for that. But then many cases, and this one they like to keep down, they don't like to talk about it, but I recall it has only been the last couple of years or so, and this did get on the news, and which is unusual, but a pilot for one of the international airlines had flown from the U.S. to Brazil, and of course he had to wait several hours before he could make a return flight. So he decided to take a walk down one of the main streets in the city. Well, anyhow, as he's walking along, suddenly he comes to and realizes that he'd been unconscious. And when he started to move, he felt a pain, and he looked down, and there was a large cut on the side of his body. And it ended up that someone had hit him on the head, knocked him out, and rapidly removed one of his kidneys. Now, why would they do that? Because on the black market, they could get probably $100,000 to $200,000 out of a kidney to somebody who had enough money to pay for it. and could find some doctor someplace who would be willing to transplant it. Now, of course, in the U.S., there is a law that says you are not allowed to pay money for kidneys. And, of course, it's considered battery if you cut somebody's kidney out. But there are ways with enough money to get around anything. And especially if you're waiting on a list and there's a lot of people ahead of you, and you're worried and concerned that your either dialysis is coming to a point that it may not be helping anymore, or it's such a pain every day to have to, or every few days, it depends, either 2 or 3 days a week, or depending on how bad it is, to go through the dialysis, and they want to get an organ, so they don't have to do that. So if they have the money, they're willing to pay, and of course, there's somebody willing to provide if you've got the money. If you go on the street with enough money, you can buy pretty much anything you want in our world today, including a Stinger missile if you wanted to buy one. You could go out, if you got the money, you can find one. So the fact is that there's a big market. The market, of course, there's, as I say, the legal market, which the only people who make out with that are the drug companies, the hospitals, and the doctors. No private people can make out with that, on that. But nonetheless, it exists. There is a market out there, and there is money out there. And when there's money and a market, there's going to be sales, and somebody is going to provide it. I mean, it's as old as going back to the early days of medicine when they were wanting to do various types of anatomical studies, and to do that they needed cadavers. Well, it wasn't looked on very friendly to be cutting on dead bodies to begin with, and the early doctors got a very bad name just because they did anatomical studies by doing dissections of cadavers. People kind of considered the body to be something special, and they didn't really like to have themselves or their friends, neighbors, or relatives chopped up in pieces on a dissecting table someplace. So they didn't look on it too kindly. In fact, the early doctors, as I say, were not considered to be very upright people. Anyhow, in attempting to further medicine, they needed bodies to do dissections. Well, since they couldn't get them, they resorted to groups of people who would go out and rob bodies and bring them into them at night, and they would pay them for them, and they could do their dissections, and of course they could keep the public locked out and not know what was going on. Now, a lot of times they would steal a body from a funeral director, or they might steal a body from a grave, and they would watch the graveyard, and when a body was freshly buried, they would immediately remove that body from the grave, and they would sell it. Then, of course, occasionally they would find some traveler. Back in those days, there were a lot of people walk places, and they would find some traveler that had died along the road, and they would grab up the body, and that would be a good one to sell. But there were times when none of those were available. So the body snatchers became very enterprising, and so a lot of times then they would bring in a cadaver for the dissection that had a fractured skull. And so if the market product wasn't there, they sometimes would make their own market. They would hit someone on the head and kill them and bring them in and sell the bodies. Now the doctors, see, they needed the bodies, so they didn't really ask any questions, although occasionally they would note that there was a terrible injury to the skull of one of the corpses that were brought in. So the market and bodies go way back. It's not anything new. Now it's a bit more sophisticated, so we're not taking whole bodies, we just need parts. Now I know in India a few years ago, I'm not sure that it's being carried on anymore legally, but it's probably still being carried on. They had set up centers in India for young women would come in, especially married women from poor families, and they could sell one of their kidneys at this center, and they would be promised either some future medical treatment if they had some type of bad health problem, or they would be promised what would be equal to $1,000 or $2,000 American dollars. However, in many cases, once they gave their organ, they might be given a few dollars with a promise they would get more later, and of course that would be the end of it. They would never get it. And so a lot of kidneys were harvested, I use the modern term, from a lot of Indian ladies for which they got almost nothing in return. And of course, they could sell it on the black market wholesale for probably $30,000 to $40,000, which wasn't bad profit since they only had to pay little or nothing to get the organs. Now, I'm sure that this still goes on around the world. And so those organs find their way to different areas around the world, because rapidly they can pack them in ice, and they've got a few hours, probably with kidney around 12 hours, to get it put in a body someplace, or it's worthless, it will deteriorate, then they can't transplant it. So they got to move fast once they get those organs. So most of them already have their market set up, and they know where they're going to take it as soon as they can get them, and they hop in their Learjet, which they can well afford, and fly off and deliver the parts and make a big living off of it. So this goes on all around the world. Or you get those, as I mentioned earlier, who just find somebody that there's nobody around, and they decide to remove their organ from them there. So that can happen, such as the airline pilot I mentioned about in Brazil. So this happens all the time, but you don't hear about that because they don't like to put it on the news, and they don't like to encourage other people that maybe try the same thing. But, you don't have to, because people are very enterprising, and if there's money to be made, they're going to find a way to go out and do it. So that is a big problem, and a lot of it is being supplied. Now, there was a movie made many, many years ago, and I don't know if you can still find it or not, or if it was ever made into DVD, but it was called Soma. And of course, Soma is from the Greek, which means body. And so this movie, the theme of it was simply that there was a hospital where this lady that was kind of got onto the story and had actually worked in a hospital, but she saw some irregular things that kind of bothered her. But what she noticed is that they seemed to have deaths on the surgical table of a lot of relatively young people from a surgery that should have been routine, like an appendectomy or some minor type of surgery. They, for some reason, would die on the table and be pronounced dead by the doctor, and they would be hauled off. Well, the more she began investigating, she began to realize that these people had no relatives. In other words, they weren't married. They maybe had come from another city to this city. They didn't really have anybody close there, and suddenly developed a problem. And when they went in this hospital and their background was investigated, those are the ones that suddenly died on the table. So the more she saw it, the more suspicious she got. And finally, she decided to follow one of the bodies. She hid. And so after the person died, the other strange thing she noted was there was not an autopsy at the hospital, even though the person died for a reason they didn't know. So she noted that they loaded this body in a vehicle, and she followed it outside of the city, and there was a large warehouse outside the city. And as she was able to get up and get through the door, because as they went in, they left the door unlocked temporarily, she got inside, and she was shocked at what she saw. There was a mammoth warehouse that had dozens and dozens of bodies hanging suspended, being kept alive, and what they were doing is they were harvesting body parts. Now, this is years ago this movie came out, when there wasn't that many transplants going on. But already there was a problem developing. People needed transplants, but there were no organs to transplant. So they were supplying it, and it ended up, well, I won't tell you the rest of the story, because if you should get it, you might find it interesting where it led to. In fact, it almost led to her being one of the Soma bodies hanging in this warehouse. But it was uncovered at the end, of course, or to make a good movie, it has to have a happy ending, and so they were able to put this operation out of business. But now this is way back when this was made, and as I say, number one, I don't know if it's available anymore, but I think there was a book first. I think someone wrote a book and then it was made into a movie. But it just shows you how something can be made a business. And here they were doing it right under the noses of the hospital for a long time before this lady got on to what was going on. And so what had happened is they had changed, they were using a type of anesthetic gas, and she found out that as she went down to the cellar of the hospital, they had it set up so that if the person was going to become a donor unwillingly, that when they put them under, they had a knob that they could switch the gas, and the gas put them in a deep coma, and they appeared to be dead. And for all practical purposes, the doctor would check them, he would pronounce them dead, and they would be gone. And of course, they wouldn't be dead, they would be keeping them suspended in an unconscious state until they could sell off the organs. So that's unfortunately one of the things that happens in terms of a market. When there's a market, there's going to be those people who go out and exploit it. So that's just one part of it. So then the other thing is that if you still don't have enough organs, in light of all of that, you go out and you encourage people to donate their organs. And so in this country, there's been a tremendous amount of push for people to fill out on their driver's license or carry a card that says they are going to be a donor. And when you get to some of the material we're going to get to later, you're going to see that one of the doctors that was interviewed in this big book, it's like an ebook, one of the doctors interviewed by this researcher said he would not carry a donor card because he knew the inside story about what happens to you if you happen to be in an accident and hospitalized, and the hospital intake shows that you're a donor. Now, that ought to arouse some interest in you that the doctor would make that comment. So at any rate, now we have a problem. We don't have enough organs. So how are we going to solve the problem? Well, as I say, you go out and you try to encourage people to become donors. And of course, a lot of times, as I said, within family or close friends, people will donate it like a kidney. Of course, you can't donate your heart or your liver while you're still alive. So that's out, but because you've got 2 kidneys, you could donate one. If you've got 2 lungs, you could donate one. There are some things you could do. So they do this. They have these big campaigns, and they, of course, appeal to your humanity. Look how these people could have their life prolonged if you would just be willing to give one of your organs at death, or several of your organs at death, because they usually try to harvest a lot of organs once you die. And it depends on how you die, of course. And so that means that that still, with all these things said, there still is a shortage of organs. Now, there's different people have suggested some different things that I thought was interesting. If I brought the papers, and if I didn't, it's okay. I can tell you what it is. Yeah, I have the paper here. There's a couple of them. Some of the reports that I've dug up. There is a well-known gentleman from Columbia College, and so happens his name is Price. And so whoever wrote this article of what he said calls it the price of organ transplants. And it's kind of a pun with his name Price. Anyhow, here's what he's saying that would solve the problem. He says there are no he says there's no successful moral justification for refusing to donate one's organs after death. Failing to donate one's organs for life-saving treatment is morally equivalent to unjustified deliberate killing. we are morally justified in preventing unjustified deliberate killing. Therefore, mandatory organ requirement or procurement is therefore morally justified. Now, I don't know if you followed his organ or not, or his comments about the organs, but here's what, in essence, he's saying is, if someone wouldn't willingly give an organ to help other people, or give all their organs at death to help people, then in essence, everyone who could not get their organ could die. And therefore, if they can die, that makes you a murderer. So anyone who refuses their organs is in essence a murderer. And so to help keep people from being murderers, the best thing to do is for the government to make it a law that everybody's organs can be harvested at death. And therefore there will be no voluntary. Everybody's going to have all their organs removed as soon as they die, and therefore we'll have a bigger supply of organs. Now that's one approach. I don't know what you think about it, but there's another one already out there. There's been some proposed laws that say, okay, it's no longer going to be an organ donor, it's going to be an opt-out donor. That means if you do not officially declare that you don't want to be an organ donor, the state can automatically take your organs at death. So whether you believe in it or want it or not, if you don't opt out, you're going to be required to donate your organs at death. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't stop it because it'll be a law. So that's one. And then this guy's approach is that you make it mandatory that everybody has to donate their organs at death. And therefore, there is no voluntary donors. It's all required and mandatory. So it's interesting the approach that people take. Now, in this country, there is a law that says you cannot sell an organ. You can donate it, but you can't sell it. But there is an exception. You can sell ova for artificial insemination or different purposes for reproduction and so forth, but you cannot sell an organ from your body. It's illegal. Of course, as I said, there's a black market that no matter what the law is on anything, there's going to be somebody that's going to figure out a way to cash in and get around it. Now, if they get caught, I don't know what the penalties are. I haven't looked at the penalties of that law, but my suspicion is it's probably going to be a slap on the hand. It seems to me that I caught something someplace that said it's going to be like, well, you have to go on probation and you may have to do some voluntary work and some things like that, but and maybe even a little fine. But I don't think you're going to go to jail for it. But nonetheless, it's out there. There is a law in this country that it's illegal to sell organs. Now, sometimes they kind of get around it if they picked up expenses for you or did some other things, but there's another group of people who have come up with a different one, and they call theirs incentivizing organ donation, a proposal to end the organ shortage, and that is that people can sell their organs legally. And so that would encourage a lot of people to go ahead and donate, especially kidneys, because there's such a shortage of kidneys and such a need for kidneys. So theirs is, why not sell them? Why not allow the people to get some kind of perks for it? Let them get some special rates on some airline tickets, or let them get some discounts at the drugstore, or something like that. But nonetheless, they're saying if we give an incentive, and it's a pretty good sized paper, it's about a stack, I'd say a 1/4 inch thick, and that's what it's all about. They're making the argument that we could help a lot and maybe even have enough organs available just by paying for it. And you do pay anyhow, it's just a matter of who gets paid for it. The hospital gets paid a lot for it, and the doctors get paid a lot for it, and the pharmaceuticals get paid a lot for it. So somebody does pay, and of course the pharmaceuticals don't mind that you get the organ either, because then they're going to sell you some drugs for the rest of your life that you have that organ, that they're going to make a lot of money off of it. We'll be talking about the money side of it a little bit later. So that's the two big proposals, or three actually. One was the opting out. Otherwise, they're going to take them automatically, and it would be hard to stop it. They're saying that under certain feeling that it violated some purpose in the family, to their theology or whatever, if it was convincing, the state could allow it not to happen to your husband or your father, mother, or child or whatever, but otherwise they would do it automatically. Now, what they did say, though, is that there's no real definition of what would represent that type of an objection, and it would be up to the hospital or whoever's involved to taking it or harvesting it. It would be up to them to determine if the objection you made met that criteria. But since they don't define what the criteria really means, then the chances of anybody being able to use that as an objection are probably pretty poor, since it's not defined. And that's when they do. That's what happens when you pass a law and you want it to go one way or the other. You use some terminology that's very obscure, and nobody knows what the definition is because you don't define it. So that way, the power people that are in charge are going to be the ones making the definition in the long run, because they're the ones that are going to benefit from it. So that leaves you out to object to it. And so the other is paying for the organs, and the other is just making it a mandatory law that everybody's organs get taken regardless. There is no opt-out. So it's interesting the direction that it's taken. Now, we want to talk a little bit more, and it looks to me like this is probably going to be a two-session. My producer is laughing and shaking her head. She's beginning to think I can't do anything in one session, any subject, and maybe she's right. I don't know. So we haven't talked about, however, one other answer yet. And I suppose we really need to get into that one before we close. And the other possibility that people are looking into, in fact, there is a major world corporation who has geared up to produce something that they believe that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar market, and that involves the subject of xenotransplantation. Now, I don't know if you've heard of that or not. Xeno means different. So, in essence, what it means is an organ transplant from a different species. That means, in our case, a non-human source, which would be some kind of animal. Now, of course, they looked around at the different animals that we might choose to use, and I have to kind of laugh when I say this. The animal that has the tissue closest to human tissue happens to be the pig family. It's interesting about pigs. I can't attest to this, but there are a few cases where people have tasted pork and have tasted human flesh. Now, I cannot tell you how that happened, but when they have tasted human flesh and tasted pork, they say they both taste the same. So, I don't know what all that means, and we won't even get into that. But what I'm saying is, this big corporation has chosen the pig as the xeno donor. And so, there's been a problem with the pig. Outside of using some heart valves, and maybe a little cartilage from pigs, they've been very unsuccessful, and they've tried that, to do transplants from a pig. But see, there's another problem too, that the sizes need to be similar. So it just happens that the heart and the kidneys and lungs and so forth of a large pig are very similar in size to a human. Therefore, they would fit okay. So in trying to do that, they ran into some major problems. And the major problem is that there's two types of a immune response in our body. One is the humoral response, and the other is a cellular response. Now, the humoral response is the one that is responsible for an anaphylactic reaction, and I'm sure most of you know what an anaphylactic reaction is. That means when you put something in your body that your body profoundly does not like or has been primed against, that body will immediately produce this massive histamine reaction against it, to the point that your throat swells and your tongue swells up, and bottom line is it can be fatal when you have an anaphylactic reaction. And so that is the humoral type reaction. It comes on rapidly, and before you know it, everything is swelled shut and you can't breathe, and it can be fatal to you. The only thing that can stop that is an immediate injection of adrenaline that will stop the response. And so people who are of a nature that they have anaphylactic reaction, I had a patient once who had anaphylactic reactions to almonds. And so if she would just touch an almond on the tip of her tongue, within a minute her body would go into a massive reaction. And if she didn't get an injection of adrenaline, or what they call epinephrine is the other term for it, immediately she could die from it before the body would settle down. So she carried this little pen called an EpiPen, which had a 1 dose of adrenaline in it. And if she felt it start to go on, she would have to inject herself with it to keep from dying, especially if there was no one around. And by the time the emergency 9/11 people could get out, she could be dead. And so that's what an anaphylactic reaction is, and that's what they found happened when they put pig tissue in a human body, is that you had an immediate cellular or anaphylactic reaction, which is a humoral reaction. And so most cases when you put it from another human, what happens is that it does not have that anaphylactic reaction or the humoral, but it has a cellular rejection. So as a rule, it takes a little longer. Now, I don't know the ramifications are with people eat pork. Probably that kind of primes their system. And then if you put a whole organ and leave it in there, that it could bring on that humoral rejection. So anyhow, this major corporation has decided that they are going to work on genetically altering these pigs that can stop this humoral response immediately, and then you only have the cellular response the same as you would from another human. Because since the humans are not exactly alike, then you have that cellular rejection over time. So what they do is they try to find somebody by typing their tissue if they have the closest tissue they can find. See, that's what happens when you're going to go for an organ transplant. They have to do your typing, tissue typing, to see that the organ that you are going to get is close as possible to your tissue type. And that's called an HLA, human leukocyte antigen factor. And they type that in you, and then the organ, the donor that it comes from has to be typed also then to see how close they are to yours, so they do a comparison. And if that particular genetic thing is close, then they're going to try the transplant from it. So at any rate, that's what they're going to do with the pigs. They're going to work to get rid of this humoral, so that it's only a cellular rejection. And they have very powerful drugs now that can knock out your immune system totally from the cellular side, so that you're not going to have a reaction. So they anticipate that by having all these organs available from all these genetically altered pigs, that they're going to make billions of dollars off of selling organs. And of course, you know, my humorous side looks at that, and you say, okay, I'm going to need a liver transplant. So you go down to the yard and you look at the pigs and you say, I think I want the one for that spotted one over there. I kind of like their looks. And you pick your organ, and then that's the one that you're going to get. Now, we haven't talked about ramifications of a transplant, but I'm going to throw this in. We'll be going into it again a little later. But again, this seemed humorous to me because there is something called cellular memory. And so when you get an organ or tissue from another being, you bring across memories and behaviors from the other person, because that memory of you is actually imprinted into that organ, and when you get it, it can change, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But I could just see it now. You've gotten this nice big pig liver in you, and you say to your friend, I think we ought to go to lunch. So, I hate to make fun of it, but it just hit me so much. And of course, you probably would have a lot of problem keeping your nose clean from the rooting, you know. In pigs, of course, they put a ring in their nose to keep them from rooting out of their pen, but they do like to root under things and in the mud, so you'd be having a lot of mud on your nose from rooting if you got a pig organ. Anyhow, I think that's humorous enough as we're coming down to the end of our and we like to end on a happy note, so we need something to be humorous and to laugh about. Next time, we're going to get really serious and get into all the implications. So we've kind of gotten you to the point now that you kind of know what the problem is and probably have some ideas why the problem exists. And if you're going to do all this transplanting, now, see, to me, as I've watched medicine, I finally came to the realization that medicine, number one, is aware of the problems. Medicine, number two, is aware that the therapy they're doing is not making people better, and that they're continuing to get sicker with more chronic illnesses. So medicine has come to the position that eventually everyone in the country is going to end up with one or more transplanted organs because there's nothing they can do about it. All that's left, if they keep you alive, because you're worthless to them if you're dead, if you can't come back and buy more drugs and have more surgeries and pay a lot more fees for diagnostic tests and so forth, you're of no value. So you got to keep you alive. So I think they've come to the realization that the only thing that's left is to transplant organs to keep people alive so they can have business. And there is a big market in keeping you alive after you've received a transplant. And so we're going to go into that in our next broadcast. We want to be sure that you go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and you review, because we're continually adding books, things that are helpful to live a healthy life, and also information of certain types. And also from our website, you can also click to our sister website, which is Alternative Health and Prevention, for information about the therapies that I do and the clinic and so forth. And otherwise, tell lots of people and have them come and watch the broadcast and watch not only this half of it, but the second half, which will be up on YouTube. As you probably know, if you're watching this, you're on YouTube watching it, since we switched to YouTube as our streamer. So you will be able to get more information and get more people watching it, and everybody will become informed, and everybody will then be informed consumers, and I think everything is going to be better from all that. So until next time, just be as healthy as you possibly can.